The first story we have tonight. I'll still take a sip of my water. Is Sou West by South by E.C.B.Preston. I suppose there were none of us on old McPhee's veranda that night who had spent more than a week ashore during the past 12 months. There were 6 of us, I remember, shipmasters mainly of the older school, who had served their time in windjammers and were now resigned to traversing the oceans beneath the shadow of black smoke instead of the towering beauty of white canvas. Men who had succumbed in their youth to the fatal domination of the sea, and were now, in the face of new and sometimes unwelcome conditions, no longer capable of withdrawing from that implacable allegiance. And McPhee himself was connected with the sea. From Bombay to Rangoon he was known, I suppose, as the best friend of 19 out of every 20 sailormen who used the ports of the East. Agent for half a dozen of the smaller shipping lines out there, in his time he must have given advice, good fellowship and hospitality to hundreds of seafaring men, from the commanders of crack passenger liners to the junior officers of rusty country ships ploughing between the shallow ports of the bay. We were always sure of a welcome in that comfortable bungalow of his, set among palms on the gentle slope of a tropical shore, and after one of his dinners, famous all over the Indian Ocean, we would settle down with a sigh of contentment in his long cane chairs on the veranda, from which we could survey the whole expanse of that harbour which has been called the Gateway of the East. 4 of us that night had been brother skippers in the same company for years. There was a fine show of Far Eastern and archipelago ships in the roadstead just then. I had brought my chief officer, who in his early days at sea had been rescued by McPhee from the clutches of a rascally Armenian owner who had turned him adrift in Garden Reach out of a moth-eaten country ship, and there was Jimmy Payne, who had recently been promoted to the command of the decrepit Java. He had always been rather a favourite of McPhee's, I fancy, and this particular dinner party was something in the nature of a celebration on his account. It was one of those nights in the tropics, hot and intensely still, when the complete immobility of the atmosphere conduces to a profound and unconquerable lassitude. McPhee's dinner had seemed sumptuous after shipboard diet, and the dark tranquillity of that veranda immersed in the thick night scents of flowers, the ease of comfortable chairs, and the fragrance of cigar smoke drifting on the sultry gloom, stifled in most of us the inclination to talk. Except in Jimmy Payne, whom we regarded indulgently as a youngster because he had got his promotion at an earlier age than the rest of us. He was a likeable fellow, and the sort who would make his mark in his profession, reliable, self-confident, thoroughly well-grounded in his duties, and not afraid of responsibility. Privately, we considered his ship the disgrace of the fleet. But we had each of us in our turn experienced the magic power, the unsurpassed enchantment of our first command. And we knew that for Jimmy, not even the Majestic herself would bear comparison with the rusted plates and scarecrow funnel of that wall-sided, barge-bowed old rattletrap of a floating warehouse known as the Java. For Jimmy, she was the first step in a ladder of many rungs. Blackburn of the Malacca had said at dinner, "One of the cracks in store for you, my lad. That's where you'll end up, dressing for dinner every night and sitting at table with ducal passengers." And perhaps the promotion, the praise, and old McPhee's champagne, potent stuff when the thermometer stands at 97, had gone to Jimmy's head. "McPhee," he said, "you're damned good to us sea-going blokes. There must be many a poor devil watch-keeping between here and Perim at this particular moment who remembers the last of your dinners and consoles himself by looking forward to the next." The thin, dry voice of McPhee, all that could be seen of him was the red glow of his cigar from the deepest shadows of the veranda, could be heard murmuring a phrase of which we could make out nothing but the words "brotherhood of the profession." "All very well," persisted Jimmy. "All very well if you had swallowed the anchor. Could understand that. I won't insult you by calling you a shore bloke, but it's not as if you'd ever been to sea." "Oh, yes," said McPhee quietly. "I was at sea for a little, as a boy. I served my time." I think this came as a surprise to all of us. It was a piece of information that I, for one, in spite of our long friendship, had never heard before, and we were sufficiently aroused out of our somnolence to emit a chorus of interested murmurs. "It was a great many years ago," McPhee went on in his quiet way. "I never took my mate's ticket. My eyesight failed. I do not regard myself as a sailor, but it is an additional link with the sea." He wished, plainly, to pursue his reminiscences no further, and our talk merged in company gossip, news of men who, in a score of ships voyaging over several thousand square miles of ocean, were connected by the bond, amorphous yet abiding, of a common house flag. Jameson was retiring. Who would get the Sumatra? Did anyone know if Thorpe was still in the Macassar? Blackburn wanted him for second mate. Another new chief in the Kelatan, the third in 2 years. An unhappy ship. Bartlett had gone to the Sarawak on station for a year. Anyone heard of Wheeler lately? Poor old Wheeler, got married or something. The Tregannu must be overdue. Never sailed, dry docked for a month, faulty propellers. They were scrapping the old Socotra. Too much scrapping. No new ships. Damned slow promotion. Our sentences, growing more and more desultory, were punctuated periodically by the slow gleam of cigar ends and the splash of soda water into a glass. "Yes, damned slow promotion," repeated somebody out of the darkness, "and at times I wonder if it's worth it when it comes." Jimmy's voice was heard protesting emphatically at this. "It's all very well for you," growled Mitchell of the Labuan. "Wait till you've had some of it. The fuss, the responsibility, and the endless monotony." I agreed that the monotony was the worst part of the whole business. "I've been bored to death sometimes for 15 years, groaned Blackburn. 80 years ago, now, skippers had excitement, variety. Anthony Enright and all that crowd. Tea races, cracking on. A damned hard life, but scarcely monotonous. Today, everything's cut and dried. To and fro, same old ports, same old voyage, year in and year out." The discussion, pursued perfunctorily and without much energy, was finally arrested by the dry tones of McPhee falling with a thin precision on its spasmodic course. "And yet," he said, "and yet there may be waiting for any one of you gentlemen on your very next sailing day, perhaps almost before you will have dropped the land over your stern, some event which will test all your resources, upset all your convictions, strain your credulity to the uttermost." "Oh, yes," murmured Mitchell in a sceptical tone. "Man overboard, passenger gone mad, a stray cyclone at the outside." "No," said McPhee with a certain decision. "I have in my mind an occurrence. It took place, it is true, a long time ago, but the circumstances remain unaltered. There is nothing, least of all its peculiar significance, to prevent it from happening again tomorrow. I could tell you the bare bones of it, enough to prove the truth of my contention. The sea is monotonous, perhaps, but of all the elements it is the most unexpected, the most incalculable. For years it will crush you with that soul-destroying and yet enthralling monotony to which you have borne testimony tonight. Yes, I say enthralling, for which of you, in spite of your grievances, has tried to leave the sea? But, sooner or later, perhaps not until you have lost the very last of your illusions, it will confront you with a problem as menacing, as devastating, as uncontrollable as a dozen cyclones. Of course, we all begged from the depths of our chairs for the story, for McPhee's yarns, when he could be induced to tell them, were as notoriously successful as his dinners. And at last that man, intimate with the lives and hearts of sailors, with the careers of ships and the characteristics of seaports, as we who listened to him were intimate with the minds of our shipmates, began, in level tones and with a kind of impassive formality, to recount the history of a problem. Chapter 2. This story has no particular locality and no particular personnel, said McPhee, except that it all took place not 1,000 miles from where we are sitting, and the persons were all known to me. And it is true, he added a little dryly, which is more than can be said, I fancy, for a few of the tales I have heard from the lips of some of you gentlemen here on my veranda. At this there came from the circle of chairs a faint expostulatory murmur, which fell back almost immediately into the profound immobility of the heat and the darkness. Yes, McPhee went on in a tranquil tone, I can vouch for every detail, and I can explain none of them. There was a pause, and the deep whistle of a steamer groping for the entrance to the roadstead reached our ears over the gleaming water and disseminated itself among the surrounding hills on the still air. P&O mails from China, commented McPhee, and then, as though his narrative had not been interrupted, it was in the early days of steam, and the ship I am speaking of was at that time the pride of her owners. But that was over 40 years ago, and I dare say any one of you gentlemen today would consign her to the scrap heap without a second glance as antiquated, slow, and extravagant. But she banged her way to and fro across the Indian Ocean at anything from 4 to 7 knots according to the time of year, and was considered the last word in cargo ship construction. Her name? Well, we'll call her the Sirdar. There's another Sirdar afloat today, but they wouldn't mind. You must remember all this occurred before some of you had left your training ships, certainly before any of you were out of your time. I could tell you a good deal about the Sirdar, about her crew and her officers, and some of her voyages. Poor devils, they had a hard enough time of it now and again in the tropics. She was not a comfortable ship, according to modern standards, and she was by no means ideal for a hot climate. There were no thermotank systems in those days, and they didn't understand stokehold ventilation as well as they do now. But none of that concerns the story, except, perhaps, that she had a decent enough crowd of officers, and a commander of the real old school, tremendously God-fearing, a martyr to his sense of duty, and with more imagination than is good for a sailor at times. Old McPhee stopped to draw carefully at his cigar, and behind the thin screen of smoke that drifted across the panorama of the roadstead, we heard his mild and not very expressive voice continuing. And it was his custom, every night before he turned in, to write the ship's course on a slate and leave it on the saloon table. One night in November, the Sirdar was making her way in a more or less southeasterly direction down the Indian Ocean. Her passage up till then had been uneventful, and there were no portentous aspects to presage the coming disruption of that monotony. Certainly the weather was bad for the time of year, unusually hot, steamy, with a high cross-swell running. The sky at sunset had been full of cloud, and a stifling wind blew in threatening puffs out of the northeast. The third officer, keeping the first watch, barefoot and sweating, saw patches of starlit sky intersected by chasms of black cloud shoot over his head and back again as the vicious seas caught her full on her port quarter. The Sirdar was generally a steady ship, but that voyage, for some reason or other, badly stowed cargo, I expect, she was particularly lively. The motion got worse. Things began to carry away in the chart room. Books, pencils, a spare pair of sea boots the captain kept up there, and the third mate began to wonder whether he ought to call the old man. For the night seemed to be getting thicker. They were full in the track of shipping, and every time he looked out of the port wing he expected to see coming down on him out of the northeast one of those black squalls that in these latitudes swallow you up like an avalanche without the least warning. But nothing happened. The third mate became uneasy, worried, flustered, if you like. He cursed the Tyndall for bad steering, although he must have known that in wicked quartering sea the poor wretch was having difficulty in keeping her within 10 or 15 degrees of her course. But you must forgive him, gentlemen, for he was very young and untried. He had only just been promoted from fourth mate, and he had never before been called upon to bear a full load of responsibility in the face of the sea's anger. He had pictured himself so often meeting such a situation with calmness and sagacity, and he was aware that at that moment he could command neither of these qualities. "The course," he shouted at the unfortunate Tyndall, "is south-east by south." They still steered by points in a good many steamships in those days. "South-east by south, do you hear?" The Tyndall, shifting his feet nervously, grasped the spokes of the wheel with an infinite resolution to obey the White Lord's command, and grunted, "Aha, Sahib," without moving his eyes from the jumping card. "Then stick to it," muttered the third, a little ashamed of his outbursts, and in that moment, in that world of heaving decks and hurtling stars, when so many of his firmest convictions were becoming obscured and quite a few of his personal values upset, he realised that he was certain of nothing, not even of the course. But he was not going to give himself away like that. He told the apprentice on duty to go down to the night watchman and fetch him a cup of coffee. "And you might look at the captain's slate as you pass," he added, casually enough. "And make sure of the course." The apprentice, naturally, did not share the apprehensions of his superior officer. He had no responsibility, as yet. He was only at the threshold of his sea life, and he was not to know for many years the belabouring anxiety of that moment when there comes for the first time, as it must have come to all of you, the necessity for confronting with your finite decisions, your restricted instincts, your limited comprehension, the limitless omnipotence of the sea. He went down to the saloon then, light-heartedly enough, but there, just inside the door, he stopped dead. For, sitting at the captain's table, apparently studying the captain's slate, was someone he had never seen before. McPhee stopped to stare out into the obscurity, as though the thread of his thoughts had been interrupted by some vision out of the past. There was no sound and no movement in the veranda, not so much as the creaking of a chair or the stirring of its occupant. Below, at our feet, the harbour echoed with a heavy rumbling as that mail steamer from the Far East let go her anchors in the roadstead, and a faint warm breeze, springing up unexpectedly, passed over the bamboos of the compound and travelled away into the darkness like a sigh. Chapter 3. "You will bear me out," McPhee resumed, that in the microcosm of a ship's existence, the appearance, the habits, even the very footsteps of each member of the ship's company become as familiar as the back of your own hand. You don't distinguish a shipmate by his face or his voice, or even the cut of his shoulders seen against a night sky. You can tell him by the mere echo of his tread on the deck over your cabin. And so, the apprentice knew at once, and simply from his attitude, that the man was a stranger. I don't know what sort of thoughts passed through his young head. He admitted afterwards that he was laid flat aback for the moment, but, after all, it was none of his business, and he was probably the last person on board to comprehend that anything unusual was happening in the Sirdar that night. The stranger, as though disturbed by the entry of that figure, not very completely dressed and damp with sweat and spray, got up, looked once at the apprentice, and walked out of the saloon down the starboard alleyway. No, he did not disappear. He strode out, opening and shutting the door like any normal person. Without making any noise, it is true, but it would have taken a good deal of stamping and banging to overcome the clatter that was going on all over the ship that night. Smashing of waves, slamming of doors, clanging of fire shovels, swishing of water on deck, thumping of propellers. The apprentice caught one glimpse of the man's face. It was black-bearded and blue-eyed, and he noticed nothing unusual about it except that, to his certain knowledge, he had never set eyes on it before. However, he went off down the port alleyway in search of the night watchman, and it was not until he was passing back through the saloon with the third officer's coffee that he remembered the slate. It was there on the table, lying in front of the chair where the stranger had been sitting, and on it was written with unmistakable clarity, S.W. by S. It struck the apprentice then that only a few minutes ago he had heard the third mate give the course as southeast by south, and as he stared at the inscription on the slate, he perceived that the letter W had been written over an erasus. Don't know to what depths his perception went, but standing there in that saloon, lurching about at all angles, with heavy seas dashing themselves against the ports, he was assailed by the sensation that something was wrong. I doubt very much if he went so far as to connect that obvious substitution with the figure of the stranger, but he took the slate with him onto the bridge and showed it to the third mate. You must all have experienced in your time at sea at least one of those occasions when some unknown and unnameable force seems to have crept aboard the ship, as though that special protection which is surely vouchsafed to those of us who endanger our bodies, if not our souls, upon the waters, had been withdrawn. I am convinced that there is such a protection. After all, there are so many mishaps that can befall a vessel at sea, mishaps which not all the skill, the forethought, and the preparedness in the world can circumvent. And so little stands between the lives of all those men entrusted to the care of the elements in an iron box, a few inches of metal, a little intricate machinery, a pair of human eyes, a finite brain, which, in a moment of weariness, of forgetfulness, of aberration, may make the one mistake that can never be rectified. Yes, there must be a special protection, and when it is withdrawn, it is as though the sea had opened before you to reveal the chasm of the universe, as though the heavens were falling on your head with the weight of worlds behind them. Not that the very young third mate experienced all that as he read the slate in the shelter of the chart room. He merely felt that in some indefinable manner things had gone beyond his control. His hand, arrested in the act of raising the cup of coffee to his lips, remained tilting the liquid in a drunken attitude. "Sou West by south," he repeated. "That can't be right." Why, where would that land us up at? Besides, I could swear. But to what could he swear? To precious little, he discovered, save the complete sanity of his old man. He held the slate under the shaded lamp over the chart-room table. "This has been monkeyed with," he announced accusingly, and the top of a wave hurtling over the port dodger, the wind seemed to be coming out more abeam, gave a tremendous and somehow derisive slap on the chart-room windows as if to say, "Have you only just discovered that?" Well, after a few minutes of stammering and hesitating and fighting with that awful fear of the young, the dread of being laughed at, the apprentice came out with the whole story. Whether the third believed it or not, I doubt if he could have told himself. But his first sensation was not one of increased alarm, but of immense relief. For now he felt justified in sending for the old man, and directly the figure of the captain, stocky but alert, with an oilskin pulled on over his pyjamas, appeared on the bridge. His subordinate experienced the subtle comfort of relinquished responsibility. He had handed over the anxiety and the necessity of making decisions to the one man who could pass on his burden to nobody. And that form, ludicrously attired and stumbling a little at the motion of the ship, that face, reticent in expression as the faces of so many sailors, deeply lined and blinking in the concentrated glare of the chart-room lights, seemed invested with the majesty of his power over the destiny of the ship and all those lives committed to his charge. "Some uncertainty about the course, sir," said the third mate. "The course?" grunted the old man. "South-east by south. I left it written down as usual." For answer, the third handed him the slate in silence, and the next words of his commanding officer confirmed that sensation of impending trouble. "This has been altered," the old man said sharply. "I left it south-east by south." They stared together at the slate, their heads almost touching, their bodies colliding softly as the roll of the ship threw them from side to side. "I left it south-east by south," the old man repeated in a dazed voice. "The apprentice, sir," ventured the third mate, "has some tale of finding a strange man in the saloon just now." The old man looked at him as though he had gone mad. "Call the apprentice," he snapped. The apprentice, hesitating on the chart-room threshold, but not unaware of his sudden importance, was told to come in and shut the door. He repeated his story. The captain, without once looking up, heard him to the end without speaking, then fired off 6 questions. "You can go," he said at last, "and don't say a word of this to anybody." As the door closed, the old man asked if that lad was to be trusted. Yes, the third had always found him perfectly reliable and honest. "Have you any explanation of this yourself?" Their eyes met expressionlessly, cloaking the secret bewilderment in their minds. "No, sir, none." For some long minutes the old man remained motionless, his face very grim, wrestling with that problem of which he alone must find the solution. He couldn't naturally ask the advice of his junior officer, but he was famous at that time all over the eastern seas for never having asked advice of anybody. He had the reputation for fighting the battles of his life entirely alone, unless he called in the assistance of his God, for I have told you that he was an eminently religious man. He relied, in fact, upon the deity for aid in most of the events of his sea career, to circumvent the rapacity of charterers, the negligence of company agents. Oh yes, I am willing to admit that agents can be negligent, the omissions of his subordinates, and the ferocity of storms. Perhaps, in that moment of profound stillness in the stuffy chart-room, for with the door shut there was no breath of air, and the thermometer stood at round about 100 degrees. He was invoking a revelation. The revelation of that substituted letter, who had written it, and why. How can we tell? And to how many of you has it been given to read the minds of your commanding officers with any degree of real intimacy? At any rate, in that period of thought or prayer, he received guidance, or came to a decision. For with extreme deliberation and a certain characteristic economy of gesture, he wiped the slate clean and rewrote the course. S.E.by.S. "I'm going to put this on the saloon table myself," he told the younger man. "When Galbraith relieves you, give him the course. But tell him he is to send down halfway through his watch to see if it has been altered. If it has been altered, he is to send for me at once. Don't say anything else to him or to anyone." He moved towards the door, but turned back on the threshold. "I am not going to have a lot of ideas let loose in this ship," he said in a tone of defiance. "I don't understand this thing, but we must get to the bottom of it." He had opened the door as he spoke, and a strong puff of wind combined with a shower of spray seemed to jump on his words and tear them out of his mouth. The third mate heard him shout once more above the racket, "We must get to the bottom of it," with an angry intonation, and then he was gone, a sturdy figure unyielding before the visible assault of the wind and the invisible assault of his doubts. Chapter 4. In due time, remember I am only telling you the bare bones of this story, the third mate was relieved. Galbraith, the second, received his instructions without comment, except on the dirtiness of the weather. But I doubt very much if it had ever occurred to him to question the vagaries of his successive captains. He was of that type of officer always popular with commanders, immensely reliable and conscientious, tractable and painstaking, and his promotion, if slow, had been steady. He settled down to pace away the hours of the middle watch, pausing now and then to stare over the Dodger at the dark hills of water lit by faint gleams under an impenetrable sky. He had no fears for the safety of the ship. He had kept too many watches in tropical seas all over the globe for that, and he was as yet untouched by the implications of that disturbing problem, menacing because inexplicable, that had boarded the Sirdar silently during that night. At 4 bells exactly, in compliance with his orders, he called the apprentice, who had come on duty at the beginning of the watch, and sent him below for the slate. He was little more than a boy, this particular apprentice, only just out of his training ship, and he still possessed almost all those ideals and illusions with which, I suppose, we all of us first go to sea. Not that his ideals have any bearing on this story, but after all, it is not so much the actions of a person, but the motives behind those actions which combine to form the stories, true or otherwise, of this life. Don't think that I am trying to give this lad any undue importance. He has none, except that, like his fellow, he was as truthful and reliable as most of us, and he, too, was brought up with a round turn on the threshold of the saloon. For he, too, was confronted by the spectacle of a strange man seated at the table. How did the sight affect him? Perhaps even he, after the passage of all these years, would find it hard to tell you. But he had already learnt that orders must be obeyed, and his orders were plain. He walked, after only a momentary hesitation, towards that figure, which appeared to him slightly formidable because he could not account for its presence. He hadn't any idea how he was going to address it, and he was not unawed by its immobility, the fixity of its gaze, a certain intensity about its attitude suggestive of, it is hard to define it exactly, of extreme concentration amounting to urgency. It did not seem to have heard his approach, and he was almost at its side before he was aware that it had risen and was looking at him, all in one movement, as it were. He expected it to speak, and indeed he had the impression that it wished to speak. But instead it turned away and walked out of the saloon by the starboard alleyway. That apprentice was seized then, remember his youth, by a panic of the kind called unreasoning. He snatched up the slate without looking at it, and ran up the gangway onto the bridge, with his heart jumping and a vision of the bearded stranger, yes, he had noted the black beard and the blue eyes, at his heels. He really hadn't time to decide, in his agitation, whether he ought to report what he had seen. And the second officer, after one glance at the slate, did not seem in the least perturbed. He too had his orders quite plain, and, unlike the third, he was not unprepared for just this eventuality. The course had been altered. Therefore he must send for the old man. Perhaps the peculiarity of this arrangement occurred to him, since presumably no one but the captain would have altered the course. I don't know. He was not a very imaginative man, and he prided himself on always being very matter-of-fact. What you would call nowadays a realist, I suppose. But even he was a little shaken out of his imperturbability by the expression on the old man's face at sight of the slate, and the note in his voice as he asked Galbraith what exactly he would say had been done to it. "Well, sir," he replied cautiously, "it has been altered." He examined it with methodical care. "No doubt about that. It looks to me, sir, as if the original second letter, E for East, I presume, had been rubbed out and this W written over it." "Precisely," said his commander in a grim tone. "But not by me." The second mate was dumbfounded at that. Who but the captain would dare to meddle with the course? It was nothing to do with him, on his word of honour. Of course, he had been up here all the time. Naturally, he hadn't left the bridge. He couldn't account for it in any way. "Neither can I," growled the old man, and proceeded to mystify his subordinate still further by sending for the apprentice. That unfortunate youth, still shivering with fright and under the impression that he had committed some awful crime, relinquished his story piece by piece as the captain dragged it out of him by the main force, as it were, of his questions. The second, of course, couldn't make head nor tail of it, but the old man listened calmly enough, nodding his head from time to time, as though he had expected to hear nothing else but this extraordinary rigmarole. The apprentice, dismissed at last, with strict orders to keep his mouth shut, was glad enough to escape from that chart-room filled with the awe-inspiring presence of his commander and the obvious concern of the second. But for the two men he had left shut up with their problem in that stuffy box of a place, there was no such easy way out, and a long brooding silence fell on that tiny room full of bright light and the slightly acrid smell of new charts. The old man, drumming with his thick, short fingers on the table in front of him, said very slowly, "Galbraith, you heard that boy's tale. Precisely the same thing happened in the first watch." Galbraith, steadying himself to meet a sharp roll of the ship, burst out, "Good God!" and stared at his captain with startled eyes. "Yes," exclaimed the other bitterly, "you may well call on him now, for only he can give us guidance in this thing. I cannot." "But who is this man, sir?" asked Galbraith. "This man who's been seen in the saloon? Or is it nothing but that lad's imagination? Who saw him the first time?" "The other apprentice. No one else has seen him. The night watchman and the chief steward, I had him roused up, report nothing unusual. Only those two lads, Galbraith, have set eyes on him. Why should they imagine it? You heard this boy say for yourself that... What's that other apprentice's name? Fletcher had told him nothing. He was plainly surprised at the very idea that Fletcher should have anything to tell him, and something has scared him. He was trembling like a rat in here just now. They heard, above the deadened rushing of the wind, a heavy sea come aboard with a crash. The Sirdar, staggering a little, began an ominously long roll, and the sound of sheets of water scurrying past the chart-room door caused Galbraith to raise his head and mutter, "A big one." But the old man, too preoccupied to notice if the whole Indian Ocean had climbed on his bridge, was saying, "And no amount of imagination, Galbraith, can explain away that business of the slate." No, Galbraith agreed. It would be difficult to do that. The Sirdar, righting herself with violence, flung him unexpectedly in the direction of his captain. "Motion's getting worse," he thought, and found himself saying loudly, almost in the other's ear, "Have you had the ship searched, sir?" "What's that? Searched?" repeated the old man fiercely. Things had grown suddenly quiet outside, and he went on in the low tones of a person who speaks in a darkened room. "It wouldn't be of the slightest use. No use at all, Galbraith. I've been thinking it over. I haven't been to sleep since I was called up in the first watch, and I've been thinking it all out. There's only one explanation. It's a visitation, Galbraith." He turned to meet the concerned gaze of his junior officer, and the young man saw that the perspiration was streaming down his face. "I don't pretend to understand it, but it seems to me to be a sort of message, and I shall get no peace until I've found the way to answer it." Chapter 5. McPhee's cigar, flying through the air, scattered a cloud of fireflies and fell with a slight hiss on the dew-soaked grass of the compound. "Yes, gentlemen, there is a problem for you. I wonder how each one of you would have dealt with it. Perhaps it doesn't sound very formidable tonight, when you have nothing more disturbing to occupy you than an old man's maunderings, no greater exigency to face than a rickshaw ride back to your ships. But I wonder how you would have felt about it if you had been up there on that bridge, surrounded by the promise of a tropical squall and the intrusive presence of that inexplicable emanation, visitation, call it what you like. Those two had spent enough of their lives in eastern seas to have learnt that there are no more elusive and unexpected stretches of water anywhere on the face of the globe. I dare say you will bear me out in that. The Atlantic has its fogs, its icebergs, and its unending gales. The Pacific, its hurricanes, and the desolation of its unending wastes. But it is here, in these particular oceans, that you find yourself confronted by the mysterious, the significant, the incredible. You may traverse for days on end these seas, unbroken by a single ripple, bland and yet reticent, presenting to your gaze the flawless aspect of burnished metal, and all the time something will tell you that they contain in their depth the very essence of unbelievable occurrences, of catastrophes, of insoluble mysteries, of occult powers. And a very little of that essence had been distilled on board the old Sirdar to bewilder the heart and try the fortitude of her captain. Oh yes, he proved equal to the test. He found the answer to that message, and it was the right one. Simple enough, too, but then the right answers to most of life's hardest problems are, in reality, simple. He gave orders that for 12 hours the Sirdar was to be headed Sou West by south. And I wonder how many of us would have the courage to steer a ship 8 points off her course at the dictation of a whim, an illusory manifestation depending on the veracity of two youths not yet out of their teens. But he didn't have to wait the whole 12 hours for his justification. Almost directly after he had made his decision, after the steersman had altered the helm, the force of the waves and the violence of those puffs of wind decreased, as though the simple action of that stolid Tyndall in shifting a few spokes of the wheel through his hands had sufficient power to appease the angry temper of the elements, and just after dawn they steamed almost on top of a derelict bark, dismasted and waterlogged in the trough of the seas. They hove to, of course, and a boat was got away. There was nothing to be done. She was a total wreck, already inert, unyielding to the swell that practically engulfed her. But they snatched one survivor from that grave which the sea had prepared for him, and as they helped him over the Sirdar's rail, the two apprentices, watching in idle curiosity, knew that they had seen him before. "He had a black beard and blue eyes," and they cried out together as though they had been shot. He had a black beard and blue eyes, and they cried out together as though they had been shot. "The man in the saloon!" The cessation of McPhee's voice was followed by a long silence. Some of the lights in the harbour had been extinguished, and the darkness seemed to have drawn closer to the bungalow, entangling in its shadows the forms of the narrator and his listeners, lost in the obscurity of the night and the profundity of their own thoughts. "That's a remarkable tale," came the meditative voice of Blackburn of the Malacca. "And how do you know it's true?" McPhee sighed gently, as though oppressed by some faint emanation out of an old past. "How do I know?" he repeated. "I was the second of those two apprentices. I told you I had served my time." The end. I rather like that one. That's nicely written, really nicely written, very atmospheric. And I like the fact that it's a ghost of someone who's not dead. So, how does that work? Ooh, spookums. But yes, I hope everybody enjoyed that. Yeah, that was a nice bit of writing. Also, hello, welcome, Ray Tracer. Nice to see you here. Welcome in. Yeah, it was good, wasn't it? I enjoyed it. But yes, I shall throw us to a break. So go do break-related things. Spooky. Don't go do spooky things. Don't go haunt anyone. Wouldn't recommend it. Not quite the time of year for that. Yeah, go do break-related things. Go grab yourself a drink. Cycle your fluids, the usual. And we shall see you back in about 5 minutes. Bye for now. again. Welcome back. I hope everybody has had a good break and has done break-related things. Yeah. Welcome back. And good night, Lady Mephistopheles, although I assume you have already gone. Thank you for being here. Yeah, so we have another story, which I'm going to probably get on with without too much delay. Thank you, Billy T. Spent your break haunting the local children. Seems like a good way to spend your time. Good plan. Yeah, love it. So yeah, we've got, as you see, pinned up at the top of chat, a link to the words for this. The words for this, like it's a song. The text for this. Unfortunately, Sam couldn't find the text for the other one because, as seems to be the case with especially this book of sea stories, because I think a lot of them are actually written by like retired captains and stuff who are going by like pen names and things, and like only wrote maybe one story, not really sort of published anywhere apart from here. So it's interesting to not be able to find some of these. But this one, I like the fact that the it's just murderer is pinned on the top of chat. This one is called The Murderer, funnily enough. So yet again, all of these sea stories, most of them at least, seem to be fairly dark in theme. But I guess that's what you get. Wonder if it's a romance. Yeah, definitely, absolutely, 100%. With a title like that, gotta be. But yes, if we are all sitting comfortably and have all the requisite things for comfiness and chillness, or a particularly beloved boat, yes, then we shall continue. With line 1, John Murderer Sutton's boat, yeah, exactly. Anyway. The Murderer by Perceval Gibbon. From the open door of the galley, where the cross, sleepy cook was coaxing his stove to burn, a path of light lay across the deck, showing a slice of steel bulwark with ropes coiled on the pins, and above it the arched foot of the mainsail. In the darkness forward, where the port watch of the Villingen was beginning the sea day by washing down decks, the brooms swished briskly, and the head pump clacked like a great, clumsy clock. The men worked in silence, though the mate was aft on the poop, and nothing prevented them from talking as they passed the buckets to and from the tub under the pump and drove their brooms along the planks. They laboured with the haste of men accustomed to be driven hard, with the shuffling, involuntary speed that has nothing in it of free strength or goodwill. The big German foremaster had gathered from the boarding-houses of Philadelphia a crew representing all the nationalities which breed sailors, and carried officers skilled in the crude arts of getting the utmost out of it. And since the lingua franca of the sea, the tongue which has meaning for Swedish carpenters, Finn sailmakers, and Greek forecastle hands alike, is not German, orders aboard the Villingen were given and understood in English. "A hand come aft here!" It was the mate's voice from the poop, robust and peremptory. Conroy, one of the 2 Englishmen in the port watch, laid down the bucket he was carrying and moved aft in obedience to the summons. As he trod into the slip of light by the galley door, he was visible as a fair youth, long-limbed and slender, clad in a serge shirt, with dungaree trousers rolled up to the knees, and girt with a belt which carried the usual sheath-knife. His pleasant face had a hint of uncertainty. It was conciliatory and amiable. He was an able seaman of the kind which is manufactured by a boarding master, short of men out of a runaway apprentice. The others, glancing after him while they continued their work, saw him suddenly clear by the galley door, then dim again as he stepped beyond it. He passed out of sight towards the lee poop ladder. The silent, hurried sailors pressed on with their work, while the big bark purred through the water to the drone of wind thrusting in the canvas. The brooms were abaft of the galley when the outcry began, which caused them to look apprehensively towards the poop without ceasing their business of washing down. First, it was an oath in explosive German, the tongue which puts a cutting edge on profanity. Then the mate's roar, "Is that what I tell you, you verfluchte fool? What? You don't understand when I speak? I show you what—" The men who looked up were on the wrong side of the deck to make out what was happening, for the chart-house screened the drama from them. But they knew too well the meaning of that instantaneous silence which cut the words off. It was the mate biting in his breath as he struck. They heard the smack of the fist's impact, and Conroy's faint, angry cry as he failed to guard it. Then the mate again, bull-mouthed, lustful for cruelty. "What? You lift up your arm to me, you dog!" More blows, a rain of them, and then a noise as though Conroy had fallen or been knocked down. And after that, a thud and a scream. The men looked at one another, and nods passed among them. He kicked him when he was down on the deck," the whisper went. The other Englishman in the watch swore in a low grunt, and dropped his broom, meeting with the wondering eyes of the Dutchman with a scowl. He was white-haired and red-faced, a veteran among the nomads of the sea, the oldest man aboard, and the only one in the port watch who had not felt the weight of the mate's fist. Scowling still, as though in deep thought, he moved towards the ladder. The forlorn hope was going on a desperate enterprise of rescue. It might have been an ugly business. There was a sense in the minds of his fellows of something sickening about to happen. But the mate had finished with Conroy. The youth came staggering and crying down the ladder, with tears and blood befouling his face, and stumbled as his foot touched the deck. The older man, Slade, saved him from falling, and held him by the upper arm with one gnarled, toil-roughened hand, peering at him through the early morning gloom. "Kicked you when you was down, didn't he?" he demanded abruptly. "Yes," blubbered Conroy, shivering and dabbing at his face. "With his sea boots, too, that—" Slade shook him. "Don't make that noise, or he might kick you some more," he advised grimly. "You'd better go now and swab that blood off your face." "Yes," agreed Conroy tremulously, and Slade let him go. The elder man watched him move forward on shambling and uncertain feet, with one hand pressed to his flank, where the mate's kick was still an agony. Slade was frowning heavily, with the tincture of thought in his manner, as though he halted on the brink of some purpose. "Conroy," he breathed, and started after the other. The younger man turned. Slade again put his hand on Conroy's arm. "Say," he said, breathing short, "is that a knife in your belt?" Conroy felt behind him, uncomprehending, for the sheath knife which he wore, sailor fashion, in the middle of his back. "What do you mean?" he asked vacantly. "Here's my knife." He drew it and showed it to Slade, the flat blade displayed in his palm. The white-haired seaman thrust his keen old face towards Conroy's, so that the other could see the flash of the white of his eyes. "And he kicked you, didn't he?" said Slade tensely. "You fool." He struck the knife to the deck, where it rattled and slid towards the scupper. "Eh?" Conroy gaped, not understanding. I don't see what—" "Pick it up," said Slade, with a gesture towards the knife. He spoke as though he strangled an impulse to brandish his fists and scream. In a nasal whisper, "It's safe to kick you," he said. "A woman could do it." "But—" Conroy flustered vaguely. Slade drove him off with a wave of his arm, and turned away with the abruptness of a man disgusted beyond bearing. Conroy stared after him and saw him pick up his broom where he had dropped it and join the others. His intelligence limped. His thrashing had stunned him, and he could not think, he could only feel like fire in his mind, the passion of the feeble soul resenting injustice and pain which it cannot resist or avenge. He stooped to pick up his knife and went forward to the tub under the head pump to wash his cuts in cold seawater, the cheap balm for so many wrongs of cheap humanity. It was an accident such as might serve to dedicate the day to the service of the owners of the Villingen. It was early and sudden, but, save in these respects, it had no character of the unusual. The men who plied the brooms and carried the buckets were not shocked or startled by it so much as stimulated. It thrust under their noses the always imminent danger of failing to satisfy the mate's ideal of seaman-like efficiency. They woke to a fresher energy, a more desperate haste under its suggestion. It was after the coffee interval, which mitigates the sourness of the morning watch, when daylight had brought its chill, grey light to the wide, wet decks, that the mate came forward to superintend the pull-all-around, which is the ritual sequel to washing down. "Lee fore brace there!" his flat, voluminous voice ordered, heavy with the man's potent and dreaded personality. They flocked to obey, scurrying like scared rats, glancing at him in timid hate. He came striding along the weather side of the deck from the remote august poop. He was like a dreadful god making a dreadful visitation upon his faithful. Short-legged, tending to bigness in the belly, bearded, vibrant with animal force and personal power, his mere presence cowed them. His gross face, the happy face of an egoist with a sound digestion, sent its lofty and sure regard over them. It had a kind of unconsciousness of their sense of humility, of their wrong and resentment, the innocence of an aloof and distant tyrant who has not dreamed how hurt flesh quivers and seared minds rankle. He was bland and terrible, and they hated him after their several manners, some with dull fear, one or two, and Slade among them, with a ferocity that moved them like physical nausea. He had left his coat on the wheelbox to go to his work, and was manifestly unarmed. The belief which had currency in the forecastle that he came on watch with a revolver in his coat pocket did not apply to him now. They could have seized him, smitten him on his blaspheming mouth, and hove him over the side without peril. It is a thing that has happened to a hated officer more than once or 10 times, and a lie, solemnly sworn to by every man of the watch on deck, has been entered in the log and closed the matter for all hands. He was barer of defence than they, for they had their sheath-knives, and he stood by the weather braces, arrogant, tyrannical, overbearing, and commanded them. He seemed invulnerable, a thing too great to strike or defy, like the white squalls that swooped from the horizon and made of the vast Villingen a victim and a plaything. His full, boastful eye travelled over them absently, and they cringed like slaves. "Belay there!" came his orders, over-loud and galling to men surging with cowardly and insufferable hate. "Lower the topsail! Haul! Belay! Upper topsail! Haul, you sons of dogs! Haul there, blast you! You want me to come over and show you?" Servilely, desperately, they obeyed him, spending their utmost strength to placate him, while the naked spirit of murder moved in every heart among them. At the tail of the brace, Conroy, with his cuts stanched, pulled with them. His abject eyes, showing the white in sidelong glances, watched the great squat figure of the mate with a fearful fascination. 8 bells came at last, signalling the release of the port watch from the deck and the tension of the officer's presence. The forecastle received them, the stronghold of their brief and limited leisure. The unkempt, weather-stained men, to whom the shifting seas were the sole arena of their lives, sat about on chests and on the edges of the lower bunks at their breakfast, while the pale sunlight travelled to and fro on the deck as the Villingen lurched in her gate. Conroy, haggard and drawn, let the coffee slop over the brim of his hookpot as he found himself a seat. "Well, what did he punch you for this time?" It was old Slade who put the question, seated on a chest with his back against the bulkhead. His pot was balanced on his knee, and his venerable, sardonic face, with the scanty white hair clinging about the temples, addressed Conroy with slow mockery. Conroy hesitated. "It was over coiling away some gear," he said. Slade waited, and he had to go on. He had misunderstood the mate's order to coil the ropes on the pins where they would be out of the way of the deck washing, and he had flemished them down on the poop instead. It was the mistake of a fool, and he knew it. Slade nodded. "Yes," he drawled. "You earned a punch and you got it. But he kicked you too, didn't he?" "Kicked me?" cried Conroy. "Why, I thought he was going to kill me. Look here, look at this, will you?" With fumbling hands he cast loose his belt and flung it on the floor and plucked his shirt up so as to leave his side bare. He stood up, with one arm raised above his head, showing his naked flank to the slow eyes of his shipmates. His body had still a boyish delicacy and slenderness. The labour of his trade had not yet built it and thickened it to a full masculinity of proportion. Measured by any of the other men in the watch, it was frail, immature, and tender. The moving sunlight that flowed around the door touched the fair skin and showed the great, puffed bruises that stood on it, swollen and horrid, like some vampire fungus growing on the clean flesh. A great Greek, all black hair and eyeball, clicked softly between his teeth. "It looks like a hell," he said softly in his purring voice. "Them is kicks all right, yeah," said someone else, and yet another added the comment of a heavy oath. Old Slade made no comment, but sat, balancing his hookpot of coffee and watching the scene under his heavy white brows. Conroy lowered his arm and let the shirt fall to cover the bruises. "You see?" he said to Slade. "I see," answered the other, with a bitter twist of his old malicious lips. Setting down the pot which he held, he stooped and lifted the belt which Conroy had thrown down. It seemed to interest him, and he looked at it for some moments. "And here's your knife," he said, reaching it to the youth, still with his manner of mockery. "There's some men it wouldn't be safe to kick with a knife in their belts." He and Conroy were the only Englishmen there. The rest were of the races which do not fight bare-handed. The big Greek flashed a smile through the black shining curls of his beard, and continued to smile without speaking. Through the tangle of incomprehensible conventions, he had arrived at last at a familiar principle. Conroy flushed hotly, the blood rising hectic on his bruised and broken face. "If he thinks it's safe with me," he cried, he'll learn different. I didn't have a chance aft there. He came on me too quick before I was expecting him. It was dark besides, or else—" "It'll be dark again," said Slade, with intent, significant eyes fixed on him, "and he needn't be expecting you. But it don't do to talk too much. Talk's easy, talk is." I'll do more than talk," responded Conroy. "You'll see." Slade nodded. "Right then, we'll see," he said, and returned to his breakfast. His bunk was an upper one, lighted and aired by a brass-framed porthole. Here, when his meal was at an end, he lay, his pipe in his mouth, his hands behind his head, and smoking with slow relish, with his wry old face upturned, and the leathery, muscular forearms showing below the rolled shirt-sleeves. His years had ground him to an edge. He had an effect as he lay, of fineness, of subtlety, of keen and fastidious temper. 40 years of subjection to arbitrary masters had left him shrewd and secret, a Machiavelli of the forecastle. Once Conroy, after seeming to sleep for an hour, rose on his elbow and stared across at him, craning his neck from his bunk to see the still mask of his face. "Slade?" he said uncertainly. "What?" demanded the other, unmoving. Conroy hesitated. The forecastle was hushed. The seamen about them slumbered. The only noises were the soothing of the water out overside, the stress of the sails and gear, and the irregular tap of a hammer aft. It was safe to speak, but he did not speak. "Oh, nothing," he said, and lay down again. Slade smiled slowly, almost paternally. It took less than 8 hours for Conroy's rancour to wear dull, and he could easily have forgotten his threat against the mate in 12, if only he had been allowed to. He was genuinely shocked when he found that his vapourings were taken as the utterance of a serious determination. Just before 8 bells in the afternoon watch, he went forward beneath the forecastle head in search of some rope yarns, and was cutting an end off a bit of waistline when the Greek, he of the curly beard and extravagant eyeballs, rose like a demon of pantomime from the forepeak. Conroy had his knife in hand to cut the rope, and the Greek's sudden smile seemed to rest on that and nothing else. "Sharp, eh?" asked the Greek, in a whisper that filled the place with dark drama. Conroy paused, apprehending his meaning with a start. "Oh, it's all right," he growled, and began to saw at the rope in his hand, while the Greek watched him with his fixed, bony smile. "No," said the latter suddenly. "That's not sharp, no. Look here, you see this?" He drew his own knife and showed it pointing towards Conroy in a damp, swarthy hand, whose knuckles bulged above the haft. His rough, spatulate thumb rasped along it, drawing from it the crepitation that proves an acute edge. "Carve him like pork," he said in his stage conspirator's whisper, "and the point, now see." He glanced over his shoulder to be sure that no one overlooked them. Then, with no more than a jerk of his hand beside his hip, threw the keen blade toward the wooden door of the bosun's locker. It travelled through the air swiftly and stuck, quivering on its thin point in the stout teak. The Greek turned his smile again for a moment on Conroy before he strode across and recovered it. "You take him," he whispered. "Better than your little knife, yes." By the mere urgency of his proffering it, the exchange was made, and Conroy found himself with a knife in his hand that fell through the strands of the manila line as though they had been butter, an instrument made and perfected for a murderer. "Yes, but look here," he began in alarm. The broad, mirthless smile was turned on him. "Just like the pork," purred the Greek, and nodded assuringly before he turned to go aft. The bull roar of the mate, who was awaiting his return with the rope yarns, roused Conroy from a scared reverie over the knife. He started. The mate was bustling furiously forward in search of him, full of uproar and anger. "Damn lazy schwein! You going to sleep here? You want me to come and fetch you? You want another smack on the moral to keep you awake, yes?" He stamped into view round the forward house, while Conroy stood, convicted of idleness by the rope in his hand only half cut through. At the same moment, a population of faces came into being behind him. A man who had been aloft shuffled down to the rail. A couple of others came into view on the deck. On top of the house, old Slade kneeled to see under the break of the forecastle head. It seemed as though a sceptical audience had suddenly been created out of his boast of the morning, every face threatening him with that shame which vanity will die rather than endure. In a panic of his faculties, he took one step toward the mate. "Hey?" The mate halted in his stride, with sheer amazement written on his face. "You want your head knocked off, yes?" "No, I don't," said Conroy out of a dry mouth. According to the usage of ships, even that was defiance and a challenge. He had forgotten the revolver with which the mate was credited. He had forgotten everything but the fact that eyes were on him. Even the knife in his hand passed from his mind. He was a mere tingling pretense at fortitude, expending every force to maintain his pose. "Put that knife away," ordered the mate suddenly. He arrested an automatic movement to obey, fighting down a growing fear of his opponent. "I've not finished with it yet," he answered. The mate measured him with a practised eye. Though he had the crazy courage of a bulldog, he was too much an expert in warlike emergencies to overlook the risk of trying to rush a desperate man armed with a knife. The chances of the grapple were too ugly. There was something lunatic and strange in the youth's glare also, and it will sometimes happen that an oppressed and cowed man in his extremity will shrug his meekness from him and become, in a breath, a desperado. This had its place in the mate's considerations. "Finish, then," he rasped, with no weakening of his tone or manner. "You don't think I'm going to wait all night for them rope yarns, eh?" He turned his back at once, lest Conroy should venture another retort and make an immediate fight unavoidable. Before his eye, the silent audience melted as swiftly as it had appeared, and Conroy was alone, with his sixth sense of having ventured too far, which stood him in place of the thrill of victory. The thrill came later, in the forecastle, where he swelled to the adulation of his mates. They, at any rate, had been deceived by his attitude. They praised him by word and look. The big Greek infused a certain geniality into his smile. Only Slade said the wrong thing. "I was ready for him as soon as he moved," Conroy was asserting, "and he knew it. You should have seen how he gaped when I wouldn't put the knife away." The men were listening, crediting him. Old Slade in the background took his pipe from his lips. "And now I suppose you're satisfied?" he inquired harshly. "How do you mean satisfied?" demanded Conroy, colouring. "You saw what happened, didn't you?" "You made him gape," said Slade. That was because he made you howl, eh? Well, ain't you calling it quits then, till the next time he kicks you?" Someone laughed. Conroy raised his voice. "He'll never kick me again," he cried. "His kicking days are over. He's kicked me once too often, he has. Quits? I guess not." Slade let a mouthful of smoke trickle between his lips. It swam in front of his face in a tenuous film of pale vapour. "Well, talking won't do it anyhow," he said. "No," retorted Conroy, and collected all eyes to his gesture. "But this will." He showed them the thin-bladed knife which the Greek had given him, holding it before them by the hilt. He let a dramatic moment elapse. "Like that," he said, and stabbed at the air. "Like that, see, like that." They came upon bad weather gradually, drawing into a belt of half-gales, with squalls that roared up from the horizon and made them, for the time, into whole gales. The Villingen, designed and built primarily for cargo capacity, was a wet ship, and upon any point of sailing had a way of scooping in water by the many tons. In nearly every watch came the roar, "Stand by your topgallant halyards!" Then the wait for 10 seconds or 10 minutes while the wind grew and the big four-masted bark lay over and bumped her bluff bows through racing seas, till the next order, shriller and more urgent, "Lower away!" and the stiff canvas fought and slatted as the yards came down. Sea boots and oilskins were the wear for every watch. Wet decks and the crash of water coming inboard over the rail, dull, cold, and the rasp of heavy sodden canvas on numb fingers became again familiar to the men. And at last there arrived the evening, gravid with tempest, on which all hands reefed topsails. The mate had the middle watch, from midnight till 4 o'clock in the morning, and for the first 2 hours it was Conroy's turn on the lookout. The rest, in oilskins and sea boots, were standing by under the break of the poop. Save for the sleeping men in the shut forecastle, he had the forepart of the ship to himself. He leaned against the after rail of the forecastle head, where a ventilator somewhat screened him from the bitter wind that blew out of the dark, and gazed ahead at the murk. Now and again the big bark slid forward with a curtsying motion and dipped up a sea that flowed aft over the anchors and cascaded down the ladders to the main deck. Spray that spouted aloft and drove across on the wind, sparkled red and green in the glare of the sidelights like brief fireworks. The splash and drum of waters, the heavy drone of the wind in the sails, the clatter of gear aloft were in his ears. He did not hear one bell strike from the poop, which he should have answered with a stroke on the big bell behind him and a shouted report on the lights. "Hi! You sleeping up there? Hey!" It was the mate, who had come forward in person to see why he had not answered. He was by the fore fife rail, a mere black shape in the dark. "Sleeping? No, sir." "Don't you hear from bell strike?" cried the mate, slithering on the wet deck toward the foot of the ladder. No, sir," said Conroy, and stooped to strike the bell. The mate came up the ladder, hauling himself by the handrails, for he was swollen beyond the ordinary with extra clothes under his long oilskin coat. A plume of spray whipped him in the face as he got to the top, and he swore shortly, wiping his eyes with his hands. At the same moment, Conroy, still stooping to the bell lanyard, felt the Villingen lower her nose and slide down in one of her disconcerting curtsies. He caught at the rail to steady himself. The dark water, marbled with white foam, rode in over the deck, slid across the anchors and about the capstan, and came aft towards the ladder and the mate. The ship rolled at the same moment. Conroy saw what happened as a grotesque trick of circumstance. The mate, as the deck slanted, slipped and reached out for the handrail with an outburst. The water flowed about his knees. He fell back against the handrail, which was just high enough for him to sit on. It was what, for one ridiculous moment, he seemed to be doing. The next, his booted feet swayed up and he fell over backward amid the confusion of splashing water that leaped down the main deck. Conroy heard him strike something below with a queer, smacking noise. "Pity he didn't go overboard while he was about it," he said to himself, acting out his role. Really, he was rather startled and dismayed. He found the mate, coiled in the scupper, very wet and still. He took hold of him to draw him under the forecastle head, where he would have shelter, and was alarmed at the inertness of the body under his hands. "Sir," he cried. "Sir, sir!" He shook the great shoulders, but quickly desisted. There was something horrible, something that touched his nerves in its irresponsiveness. He remembered that he might probably find matches in the lamp locker, and staggered there to search. He had to grope in gross darkness about the place, touching brass and the uncanny smoothness of glass, before his hand fell on what he sought. At last he was on one knee by the mate's side, and a match shed its little illumination. The mate's face was odd in its quietude, and the sou'wester of oilskin was still on his head, held there by the string under the chin. From under its edge, blood flowed, steadily, thickly, appallingly. "But," cried Conroy. The match flame stung his fingers and he dropped it. "Oh, Lord," he said. It occurred to him then, for the first time, that the mate was dead. The men aft, bunched up under the break of the poop, were aware of him as a figure that came sliding and tottering toward them and fell sprawling at the foot of the poop ladder. He floundered up and clutched the nearest of them, the Greek. "The mate's dead," he broke out in a kind of breathless squeal. "Somebody call the captain! The mate's dead!" There was a moment of silence, then a cackle of words from several of them together. The Greek's hands on his shoulders tightened. He heard the man's purring voice in his ear. "How did you do it?" Conroy thrust himself loose. The skies of his mind were split by a frightful lightning flash of understanding. He had been alone with the mate. He had seen him die. He was sworn to kill him. He could see the livid smile of the Greek bent upon him. I didn't do it," he choked passionately, and struck with a wild, feeble hand at the smile. "You liar! I didn't do it!" "Hush!" The Greek caught him again and held him. Some of the men had started forward. Others had slipped into the alleyway to rouse the second mate and captain. The Greek had him clutched to his bosom in a strong embrace and was hushing him as one might hush a scared child. Slade was at his side. "He slipped, I tell you, he slipped at the top of the ladder. She'd shipped a dollop of water and then rolled, and over he went. I heard his head go smack and went down to him. I never touched him, I swear it, I never touched him." "Hush." It was Slade this time. "And you're sure he's dead?" "Yes, he's dead." "Well." The old man exchanged nods with the Greek. "All right. Only don't tell the captain that tale. It ain't good enough." "But," began Conroy. A hug that crushed his face against the Greek's oilskin breast silenced him. "What is all this?" It was the captain, tall, august, come full-dressed from his cabin. At his back, the second mate, with his oilskin coat over his pyjamas, thrust forward his red, cheerful face. Slade told the matter briefly. "And it scared young Conroy all to bits, sir," he concluded. "Come forward," bade the captain. "Get a lamp, someone." They followed him along the wet, slippery deck slowly, letting him pass ahead out of earshot. "It was a belaying pin, yes?" queried the Greek softly of Conroy. He might have hit his head against a pin," replied Conroy. "Eh?" The Greek stopped. Might have. Hit his head? That's fine, he might have hit his head, Slade, you hear that?" "Yeah, it ain't bad," replied Slade, and Conroy, staring in a wild attempt to see their faces clearly, realised that they were laughing silently and heartily. With a gesture of despair, he left them. A globe lamp under the forecastle head lighted the captain's investigations, gleaming on wet oilskins, shadow-pitted faces, and the curious, remote thing that had been the mate of the Villingen. Its ampler light revealed much that the match flame had missed from its field. The manner in which the sou'wester and the head it covered were caved in at one side, the cut in the sou'wester through which clotted hair protruded, the whole ghastliness of death that comes by violence. With all that under his eyes, Conroy had to give his account of the affair, while the ring of silent, hard-breathing men watched him and marvelled at the clumsiness of his story. "It is strange," said the captain. "Fell over backwards, you say? It's very strange. And where did you find the body?" The scupper and deck had been washed clean by successive seas. There was no trace there of blood, and none on the rail. Even while they searched, Water spouted down on them. But what Conroy noted was that no pin stood in the rail where the mate had fallen, and that the hole that might have held one was empty. "Ah well," said the captain at last, "the poor fellow is dead. I do not understand quite how he should fall like that, but he is dead. 4 of you get the body aft." "Please, sir," accosted Conroy, and the tall captain turned. "Well, what is it?" Can I go below, sir? It was me that found him, sir. I feel rather bad." "So?" The tall captain considered him inscrutably. He, the final arbiter of fates. "You feel bad, yes? Well, you can go below." The little group that bore the mate's body shuffled aft, with the others following like a funeral procession. A man looked, shivering, out of the door of the starboard forecastle and inquired in loud whispers, "Was ist los? Sag mal, was ist denn los?" He put his inquiry to Conroy, who waved him off and passed to the port forecastle on the other side of the deckhouse. The place was somehow strange, with its double row of empty bunks like vacant coffin shelves in a vault, but solitude was what he desired. The slush lamp swung and stank and made the shadows wander. From the other side of the bulkhead he could hear stirrings and a murmur of voices as the starboard watch grew aware that something had happened on deck. Conroy, with his oilskin coat half off, paused to listen for comprehensible words. The opening of the door behind him startled him, and he spun round to see Slade making a cautious entry. He recoiled. "Leave me alone," he said in a strangled voice before the other could speak. "What are you following me for? You want to make me out a murderer. I tell you, I never touched him." The other stood just within the door, the upper half of his face shadowed by his sou'wester, his thin lips curved in a faint smile. "No," he said mockingly, "you didn't touch him. And I make no doubts you take your oath of it. But you shouldn't have put that pin back in the rail when you was through with it all the same." "There wasn't any pin there," said Conroy quickly. He had backed as far from Slade as he could, and was staring at him with horrified eyes. "But there would have been if I hadn't took a look round while you were spinning your yarn to the old man," said Slade. "I knew you was a fool." With a manner as of mild glee, he passed his hand into the bosom of his coat, still keeping his sardonic gaze fixed on Conroy. "Good thing you've got me to look after you," he went on. "Thinks I, he might easy make a mistake that'd cost him dear, so I took a look round. And I found this." From within his coat he brought forth an iron belaying pin, and held it out to Conroy. "See?" His finger pointed at it. "That's blood, that is, and that's hair. Look for yourself. Now I suppose you'll tell me you never touched him." "He hit his head against it when he fell," protested the younger man. "He did! Oh, God, I can't stand this!" He sank to a seat on one of the chests and leaned his face against the steel plate of the wall. "It is Ed," snorted old Slade. "Couldn't you have fixed up a better yarn than that? What are you snivelling at? Do you think you're the only man who's ever stove in a mate's head, and him a murdering man-driver? Keep them tales for the old man. He believes them, seemingly, but don't you come them on me." Conroy was moaning. I never touched him. "Never touched him." "Here, take the pin, it's yours." He shrank from it. No! Slade pitched it to his bunk, where it lay on the blanket. "It's yours," he repeated. "If you don't want it, heave it overboard yourself or stick it back in the rail. Never touched him. You make me sick with your never touched him." The door slammed on his scornful retreat. Conroy shuddered and sat up. The iron belaying pin lay where it had fallen on his bed, and even in that meagre light it carried the traces of its part in the mate's death. It had the look of a weapon rather than of a humble ship fitting. It rolled a couple of inches where it lay as the ship leaned to a gust, and he saw that it left a mark where it had been, a stain. He seized it in a panic and started for the door to be rid of it at once. As if a malicious fate made him its toy, he ran full into the Greek outside. "Ah!" The man's smile flashed forth, wise and livid. "And so you had it in your pocket all the time, then?" Conroy answered nothing. It was beyond striving against. He walked to the rail and flung the thing forth with hysterical violence into the sea. The watch going below at 4 o'clock found him apparently asleep, with his face turned to the wall. They spoke in undertones, as though they feared to disturb him, but none of them mentioned the only matter which all had in mind. They climbed heavily to their bunks, there to smoke the brief pipe and then to slumber. Only Slade, who slept little, would from time to time lean up on one elbow to look down and across to the still figure which hid its face throughout the night. Conroy woke when the watch was called for breakfast by a man who thrust in his head and shouted. He had slept at last, and now as he sat up it needed an effort of mind to recall his trouble. He looked out at his mates, who stood about the place pulling on their clothes, with sleep still heavy on them. They seemed as usual. It was his turn to fetch the coffee from the galley, he remembered, and he slipped out of his bunk to dress and attend to it. "I won't be a minute," he said to the others as he dragged on his trousers. A shaggy young Swede near the door was already dressed. "I will go," he said. "You don't bother," and forthwith slipped out. The others were looking at him now, glancing with a queer, sharp interest and turning away when they met his eyes. It was as though he were a stranger. "That was a queer thing last night," he said to the nearest. "Yes," the other agreed with a kind of haste. They sat about at their meal when the coffee had been brought by the volunteer under the same constraint. He could not keep silent. He had to speak and make them answer. "Where is he?" he asked abruptly. "On the gratings," he was told, and the Swede who fetched the coffee added, "Sales is sewing him up now already." "We'll see the last of him today," said Slade. "He won't kick nobody again." There was a mutter of agreement, and eyes turned on Conroy again. Slade smiled slowly. "Yes, he kicked once too many times," said the Greek. The shaggy young Swede wagged his head. "He'd think it was safe to kick Conroy, but it ain't," he observed profoundly. "No, it ain't safe. He got what he asked for. Didn't know what he'd go up against. No, it ain't safe. Maybe he wish he ain't so handy with his feet now." They were all talking. Their mixed words came to Conroy in broken sentences. He stared at them a little wildly, realizing the fact that they were admiring him, praising him, and afraid of him. The blood rose in his face hotly. "You fellas talk," he began, and was disconcerted at the manner in which they all fell silent to hear him. "You talk as if I'd killed him." "Well, ach was." He faced their smiles, their conciliatory gestures, with a frown. "You better stop it," he said. "He fell, see? He fell and stove his head in. And any fella that says he didn't—" His regard travelled from face to face, giving force to his challenge. "If he ain't going to say nothings," they assured him mildly, "you don't need to be scared of us, Conroy." "I'm not scared," he said with meaning, "but look out, that's all." When breakfast was over, it was his turn to sweep up. but there was almost a struggle for the broom and the privilege of saving him that trouble. It comforted him and restored him. It would have been even better but for the presence of Slade, sitting aloft in his bunk, smiling over his pipe with malicious understanding. The Villingen was still under reefed upper topsails, walking into the seas on a taut bowline, with water coming aboard freely. There was little for the watch to do, save those trivial jobs which never fail on a ship. Conroy and some of the others were set to scrubbing teak on the poop, and he had a view of the sailmaker at his work on the gratings under the break of the poop, stitching on his knees to make the mate presentable for his last passage. The sailmaker was a bearded Finn, with a heavy, darkling face and the secret eyes of a fawn. He bent over his task, and in his attitude and the slow rhythm of his moving hand there was a suggestion of ceremonial, of an act mysterious and ritual. Halfway through the morning, Conroy was sent for to the cabin, there to tell his tale anew, to see it taken down, and to sign it. The captain even asked him if he felt better. "Thank you, sir," replied Conroy. "It was a shock, finding him dead like that." Yes, agreed the captain. "I can understand. A great shock, yes." He was bending over his papers at the table. Conroy smiled over his bowed head. Returning on deck, he winked to the man at the wheel, who smiled uncomfortably in return. Later, he borrowed a knife to scrape some spots of paint off the deck. He did not want to spoil the edge on his own. They buried the mate at 8 bells. The weather was thickening, and it might be well to have the thing done. The hands stood around, bareheaded, with the grating in the middle of them, one edge resting on the rail, the other supported by 2 men. There was a dark smudge on the sky up to windward, and several times the captain glanced up from his book towards it. He read in German slowly, with a dwelling upon the sonorous passages, and towards the end he closed the book and finished without its aid. Conroy was at the foot of the ladder. The captain was above him, reading mournfully, solemnly, without looking at the men. They were rigid, only their eyes moving. Conroy collected their glances irresistibly. When the captain had finished his reading, he sighed and made a sign, lifting his hand like a man who resigns himself. The men holding the grating tilted it. The mate of the Villingen, with a little jerk, went over the side. "Stand by your topsail halyards!" roared the second mate. Conroy, in the flurry, found himself next to a man of his watch. He jerked a thumb in the direction of the second mate, who was still vociferating orders. "Hark at him," he said. "Before we're through, I'll teach him manners too." And he patted his knife. The end.